The injured Marine stood saluting for hours in the scorching heat. When a group of bikers showed up, the sun beat down mercilessly on the small town of Millbrook, Alabama, its rays unforgiving on the weathered asphalt of Main Street. Despite the sweltering heat, the crowd had gathered outside the town's modest Veterans Memorial, their eyes fixed on a solitary figure standing rigidly at attention. Sergeant Jack Hawkins, USMC, cut an imposing figure even at 62 years old. His salt and pepper hair was cropped close to his head in a military cut that he'd maintained long after his discharge. His dress blues, meticulously pressed and adorned with a chest full of ribbons, seemed to absorb the heat. Jack showed no sign of discomfort. His right arm was raised in a crisp salute, his eyes focused on the memorial's flag, which hung limply in the still air. To the casual observer, Jack might have looked like any other veteran paying his respects. But those who knew him saw the slight tremor in his extended arm, barely perceptible sway in his stance. They knew the toll this simple act was taking on his body. 3 years earlier, Jack had been in a devastating car accident that had left him with a traumatic brain injury and partial paralysis on his right side. The doctors had told him he might never walk again, let alone stand for extended periods. But Jack Hawkins had never been one to accept limitations. As the town clock struck noon, marking the first hour of Jack's vigil, whispers began to circulate through the growing crowd. How long's he planning to stay up there? Didn't the doc say he shouldn't be on his feet for more than 30 minutes? Someone should tell him to take a break. But no one approached Jack. They knew better than to interfere with a Marine on a mission. Among the onlookers was Sarah Mitchell, Jack's physical therapist, and one of the few people who truly understood the magnitude of what he was attempting. At 35, Sarah had worked with dozens of veterans, but none quite like Jack. His determination bordered on stubbornness, his drive to recover pushing the boundaries of what she thought possible. As the second hour ticked by, Sarah watched Jack with a mixture of admiration and concern. She saw the beads of sweat forming on his brow, the slight trembling in his knees. But she also saw the unwavering resolve in his eyes, a set of his jaw that told her he wasn't going to back down. "Jack," she murmured under her breath, "what are you trying to prove?" The answer, of course, lay in the date. It was May 30th, the day before Memorial Day, exactly 5 years since the death of Jack's son, Michael. Lance Corporal Michael Hawkins had been killed in action in Afghanistan, his young life cut short by an IED on a dusty road outside Kandahar. Jack's vigil was more than a testament to his own resilience. It was a tribute to his son and all the fallen heroes who had given their lives for their country. Each minute he stood there was a battle against his own broken body, fight to honor those who could no longer stand for themselves. As the third hour approached, the crowd had swelled to several hundred. Word had spread through the town and beyond, drawing people from neighboring communities. Local news vans had arrived, their cameras trained on Jack's unwavering figure. Among the newcomers was Mayor Robert Thompson, his portly frame pushing through the crowd with an air of self-importance. "What's all this about?" he demanded, mopping his brow with a monogrammed handkerchief. It was old Bill Jenkins, the owner of the local hardware store and a Vietnam vet himself, who answered. "It's Jack Hawkins, Mr. Mayor. Been standing there since 11 this morning. Says he's going to hold that salute for 3 full hours." The mayor's bushy eyebrows shot up. 3 hours? In this heat? Is he crazy? Old Bill's eyes narrowed. "He's honoring his boy, sir, and every other soldier who never made it home. I'd say that's about as sane as a man can be." Mayor Thompson had the grace to look abashed. He'd forgotten about Jack's son, about the gold star flag that still hung in the window of the Hawkins home on Cedar Street. "Of course," he mumbled. "Carry on." As the town clock began to toll 3, a hush fell over the crowd. Jack had been standing for nearly 3 hours, his salute never wavering despite the visible toll it was taking on his body. Sarah Mitchell pushed her way to the front of the crowd, her medical instincts warring with her respect for Jack's mission. Just as she was about to intervene, a low rumble filled the air. It started as a distant growl, growing louder with each passing second. The crowd began to murmur, heads turning to look down Main Street. And then they appeared. A line of motorcycles, stretching as far as the eye could see, thundered into view. Their riders, clad in leather vests emblazoned with military insignias, formed a formidable presence as they approached the memorial. For a moment, no one moved. The bikers sat astride their machines, their eyes fixed on Jack's saluting figure. The crowd held its breath. Unan. The lead rider, a mountain of a man with a silver beard reaching down to his chest, raised his sure of what was about to unfold. And then, with a nod from their leader, the bikers began to dismount. One by one, they formed a line, their backs straight, faces solemn. And as the town watched in awe, each biker raised their right hand in a perfect military salute. Jack Hawkins, Marine, father, and wounded warrior, was no longer standing alone. Brotherhood had arrived to stand with him, to share his burden and honor his sacrifice. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across Main Street, the scene was set for an extraordinary demonstration of solidarity, respect, and the unbreakable bonds forged in service to one's country. But for Jack Hawkins, whose arm was beginning to shake visibly and whose legs threatened to buckle, the true test was only just beginning. Next hours would push him to his absolute limits, challenging not just his body, but his spirit. And as the bikers stood in silent support, the small town of Millbrook was about to witness an act of courage and determination that would change them all forever. As the bikers stood in silent salute alongside Jack, crowd's murmurs gradually subsided into a respectful hush. The only sounds were the gentle flapping of the flag in the late afternoon breeze and the occasional chirp of birds, oblivious to the human drama unfolding below. Jack's mind, however, was far from quiet. As he stood there, his body screaming in protest, memories flooded his consciousness. Each passing minute seemed to unlock another chapter of his life, as if the physical endurance was peeling back layers of time. He remembered the day he had enlisted in the Marines, barely 18 years old, full of patriotic fervor and dreams of glory. The grueling weeks of boot camp at Paris Island, where he had been broken down and rebuilt into a Marine. His first deployment to the Gulf, fear and exhilaration of combat. The bonds formed with his fellow Marines were stronger than blood. But most of all, he remembered Michael, who had been born while Jack was on his second tour in Iraq. He recalled returning home to find a tiny, squalling bundle in his wife Linda's arms. The instant, overwhelming love he had felt, mixed with a terror he had never experienced in combat. Fear of not being good enough, failing this perfect, innocent being who depended on him. As the minutes ticked by, Jack's memories skipped forward. Michael's first steps, first words, first day of school. The way his son's eyes had lit up when Jack taught him to throw a baseball. Pride in his voice when he'd tell his friends, "My dad's a Marine." And then, the day Michael had come to him, just shy of his 18th birthday, and said, "Dad, I want to enlist." Jack's heart had swelled with pride, even as fear clutched at his gut. He knew the risks, the sacrifices required, but he also knew the honor, sense of purpose that came with serving one's country. So he had hugged his son tight and said, "I'm proud of you, son. So damn proud." A sharp pain in his lower back jolted Jack back to the present. He had been standing for nearly 4 hours now, and his body was beginning to rebel in earnest. The tremor in his right arm had become more pronounced, and a dull ache had settled into his shoulders and neck. Dara Mitchell, still watching from the crowd, saw the signs of distress. She took a step forward, ready to intervene, but stopped when she caught Jack's eye. The look he gave her was clear. "Not yet. I'm not done." As if sensing Jack's struggle, the leader of the biker group, the silver-bearded giant, spoke for the first time. His voice was low and gravelly, but carried across the silent square. "Marines, attention!" The bikers who had served in the Marines snapped to attention, their salutes, if possible, becoming even crisper. "Army!" More bikers straightened. "Navy! Air Force! Coast Guard!" With each call, more of the bikers stood at attention, until every one of them was saluting alongside Jack. The biker leader then addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're witnessing here is more than just a man standing still. This is a testament to the spirit of every man and woman who has ever worn the uniform of our country. This is for those who came home and for those who didn't." His words seemed to energize Jack, found a new reservoir of strength. As the biker spoke, Jack's mind drifted again. this time to the day that had changed everything. It had been a beautiful spring morning, much like today. Jack had been in the garage tinkering with his old truck when he saw the car pull up. Two Marines in dress uniform stepped out, and Jack felt his world tilt on its axis. He knew why they were there. Every military parent dreads that sight, but knowing didn't make it any easier to hear the words, "We regret to inform you." The days that followed were a blur of grief and anger. The funeral, with its 21-gun salute that made Jack flinch each time. The folded flag presented with solemn words of gratitude for Michael's sacrifice. Endless stream of well-wishers, their words of comfort feeling hollow in the face of such loss. Linda had retreated into herself, spending days at a time in Michael's room, surrounded by his things. Jack had thrown himself into physical labor, working himself to exhaustion each day in a vain attempt to outrun his pain. It was on one of these punishing workdays, 2 years after Michael's death, that the accident happened. Jack had been up on a ladder, clearing gutters for old Bill Jenkins, when a wave of dizziness hit him. The next thing he knew, he was waking up in a hospital bed, his body a mass of pain and his right side frustratingly unresponsive. The doctors had been brutally honest. The fall had caused significant trauma to his brain and spinal cord. They weren't sure if he'd walk again, let alone regain full use of his right side. They didn't know Jack Hawkins. From the moment he could speak, Jack had demanded to start therapy. Every day was a battle against pain, frustration, and the limitations of his own body. But Jack approached his recovery with the same determination he'd brought to every challenge in his life. It was during these grueling therapy sessions that he had met Sarah Mitchell. Young enough to be his daughter, Sarah had an old soul and a stubborn streak that matched Jack's own. She pushed him harder than the other therapists dared, seeming to instinctively understand that for Jack, this wasn't just about physical recovery. It was about reclaiming his identity as a Marine, as Michael's father. Now, as Jack stood at the memorial, his body once again testing its limits, he drew strength from those therapy sessions. From Sarah's encouragement, from the memory of Michael's smile, from the silent support of the bikers standing beside him. The town clock began to chime 5 o'clock. Jack had been standing for 6 hours, double his original goal. His uniform was soaked with sweat, his legs trembling visibly now. Still, he didn't lower his salute. In his mind, he wasn't just standing for Michael anymore. He was standing for every Marine, every soldier, every man and woman who had ever made the ultimate sacrifice. He was standing for the families left behind, for the dreams cut short, the futures never realized. As the last chime faded away, a new sound filled the air. It started low, almost imperceptible, quickly grew. Bikers, still at attention, had begun to hum. The melody was immediately recognizable. The Marines' hymn, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. The humming grew into words, the bikers' deep voices filling the square with the beloved anthem. The crowd, moved by the unexpected chorus, began to join in. And there, as the sun began to set on Millbrook, Alabama, Sergeant Jack Hawkins, USMC Ret, stood tall. His body was failing, but his spirit soared with each word of the hymn. He was a Marine. He was a father. He was a symbol of endurance and honor. And he would not fall. Not yet. Not while the memory of his son and countless others demanded to be honored. The true test of Jack's endurance was yet to come, but for now, bolstered by the song and the solidarity surrounding him, he stood firm. The night was young, and Jack Hawkins had miles to go before he could rest. As the last notes of the Marines' hymn faded into the twilight, a palpable sense of anticipation settled over the crowd. The initial shock of the bikers' arrival had given way to curiosity and a growing sense of unity. The disparate groups, townspeople, veterans, and leather-clad bikers, had been united by Jack's unwavering salute and the shared reverence for what it represented. The leader of the bikers, who had remained silent since calling his group to attention, stepped forward. His massive frame cast a long shadow in the fading light as he approached Jack. For a moment he stood there, his own salute mirroring Jack's. Then, with the gentleness that belied his intimidating appearance, he spoke softly, meant for Jack's ears alone. "Sergeant Hawkins, I'm Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Bear Blackwell, United States Marine Corps, retired. My boys and I were with the Veterans Vanguard Motorcycle Club. We heard about what you're doing here and, well, we couldn't let a fellow Marine stand alone. Jack's eyes, which had remained fixed on the memorial flag, flickered briefly to Bear's face. A look of recognition and gratitude passed between the two men, the unspoken understanding that exists between those who have served. Bear continued, his voice still low, but now tinged with concern. You've done your duty, Sergeant, more than anyone could ask. Maybe it's time to stand down. For the first time since he'd taken his position at the memorial, Jack spoke. His voice was hoarse from hours of disuse and dehydration, but the resolve in it was unmistakable. Not yet, Gunny. Not while there are still names to be remembered. Bear nodded, understanding etched in the lines of his weathered face. He turned to address his fellow bikers and the crowd beyond. All right, people, listen up. Sergeant Hawkins here isn't ready to quit, so neither are we. But he's been on his feet for 6 hours now, and the night's just beginning. He's gonna need our help. A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled bikers. Bear began issuing orders with the practiced ease of a seasoned NCO. Johnson, Ramirez, you two head to the store and get water, energy bars, anything that'll help keep the sergeant on his feet. Martinez, you're on crowd control. Make sure we keep a clear space around the memorial. The rest of you, we're setting up a rotation. 2-hour shifts, standing at attention with the sergeant. No one stands alone tonight. Bikers moved with military precision, each taking up their assigned tasks without question. The townspeople, inspired by this display of organization and solidarity, began to offer their own support. Sarah Mitchell, who had been watching the proceedings with growing concern, approached Bear. Excuse me, Gunnery Sergeant, I'm Sarah Mitchell, Jack's physical therapist. I understand what he's trying to do here, but medically speaking, this is extremely risky. His body has already been pushed well beyond its safe limit. Bear's expression softened as he looked at the young woman. I hear you, ma'am, but I also know that look in his eye. He's not stopping until he feels he's done right by his boy and every other fallen hero. Best we can do is make sure he's got the support he needs to see it through safely. Sarah nodded, recognizing the truth in Bear's words. All right then, I'll stay to monitor his condition, but if I say he needs to stop, will you back me up? You have my word, ma'am, Bear replied solemnly. As night fell in earnest, the scene at the memorial transformed. Floodlights, hastily arranged by the town's maintenance crew, illuminated Jack and the rotating honor guard of bikers. Local businesses began sending over food and drinks for the growing crowd. Someone had set up a sound system, and now patriotic music played softly in the background. The mayor, seeing an opportunity to be part of something bigger than himself, had declared an impromptu vigil. People began bringing candles, flowers, and photos of their own loved ones who had served. The memorial, which had stood quietly for years, was now the vibrant heart of the community. As the night wore on, Jack's struggle became more visible. His arm, held high for so long, shook constantly now. Sweat poured down his face, and his breath came in ragged gasps. But still, he didn't waver. Every hour on the hour, Bear would approach Jack and quietly ask if he was ready to stand down, and every time Jack's response was the same. Not yet, Gunny. Not yet. Around midnight, a new group arrived at the memorial. They came quietly, almost hesitantly. A group of young men and women, most of them looking to be in their early 20s. They stood at the edge of the crowd, watching Jack with a mixture of awe and something else. Guilt? It was old Bill Jenkins who first recognized. Well, I'll be, he muttered. That's young Tommy Ferris and his friends. They're the ones who've been causing all that trouble lately. Vandalism, petty theft, that sort of thing. Bear overheard the old man's words and studied the newcomers with interest. He saw the way they held themselves, a look in their eyes. He recognized it from his own youth. Aimlessness, the barely contained anger at a world that didn't seem to have a place for them. Making a decision, Bear approached the group. Evening, folks, he said, his tone friendly but carrying an undercurrent of authority. Come to pay your respects? The young man old Bill had identified as Tommy stepped forward, posture defensive but his eyes uncertain. We heard about what was happening here. Thought we'd check it out. Bear nodded, expression thoughtful. Well, since you're here, how about making yourselves useful? We could use some help keeping the area clean, maybe passing out water Tommy and his friends exchanged surprised looks. They were used to being viewed with suspicion, not being invited to participate. After a moment of silent communication, Tommy nodded. "Yeah, okay, we can do that." As the young troublemakers integrated into the support efforts, Bear couldn't help but smile. He'd seen it happen countless times in the Marines. Give someone a purpose, chance to be part of something bigger than themselves, and watch them rise to the occasion. The night continued, each hour bringing new challenges and unexpected moments of grace. Local churches opened their doors, offering rest and refreshment to those keeping vigil. Children, allowed to stay up well past their bedtimes, laid hand-drawn pictures at the base of the memorial. And through it all, Jack Hawkins stood, his salute a beacon of endurance and remembrance. His body was failing, but his spirit seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. In his mind, he saw the faces of those he was honoring. Michael, fallen comrades, every service member who had given their life for their country. As dawn began to paint the eastern sky with the first hints of light, a sense of anticipation began to build. Jack had been standing for nearly 18 hours, far beyond what anyone had thought possible. The question on everyone's mind was, how much longer could he go on? The answer would come with the rising sun, bringing with it a moment that would change not just Jack's life, but the entire community of Millbrook, in ways no one could have anticipated. As the first rays of sunlight began to peek over the horizon, casting a golden glow across Millbrook, the crowd at the Veterans Memorial stirred with renewed energy. They had weathered the night together, townspeople, bikers, and reformed troublemakers alike, united in their support of Jack Hawkins and what he stood for. Jack himself was a sight to behold. His once crisp uniform was now wrinkled and sweat-stained, his face etched with lines of exhaustion. Yet his arm remained raised, his salute unwavering despite the visible tremors that ran through his body. He had been standing for over 18 hours, defying medical odds and the limits of human endurance. Sarah Mitchell, who had stayed through the night monitoring Jack's condition, approached Bear with worry evident in her tired eyes. "His body is shutting down," she said quietly. "He's running on sheer willpower at this point. We need to end this before he collapses." Bear nodded gravely. He had seen men push themselves to the brink before, but this was something else entirely. "I hear you, ma'am. Let me talk to him one more time." As Bear made his way to Jack, a commotion at the edge of the crowd caught everyone's attention. A black SUV had pulled up, and men in dark suits emerged, scanning the area with professional scrutiny. Then, from the back seat, a figure stepped out that caused a ripple of shocked whispers to sweep through the gathering. It was the governor. Governor Richard Harmon was a tall, distinguished man in his early 60s, known for his military service before entering politics. He moved through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging brief words with people as he made his way to the memorial. As he approached Jack and Bear, the governor's security detail moved to clear the area, but he waved them off. This was a moment that didn't need the trappings of office. "Sergeant Hawkins," the governor said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "I'm Richard Harmon. I served with your son in Afghanistan." For the first time in nearly 19 hours, Jack's eyes left the flag he had been focused on. He looked at the governor, recognition dawning in his tired gaze. The governor continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Michael saved my life during an ambush outside Kandahar. He was one of the bravest men I've ever known. When I heard about what you were doing here, I had to come and pay my respects, both to Michael's memory and to your incredible display of devotion." A single tear traced its way down Jack's weathered cheek, but his salute never faltered. Governor Harmon straightened, squaring his shoulders. Then, with practiced precision, he raised his own hand in a crisp salute. "Sergeant Hawkins, on behalf of the state of Alabama and a grateful nation, I thank you for your service and for this extraordinary tribute to our fallen heroes." The governor held his salute, standing shoulder to shoulder with Jack. Bear, recognizing the significance of the moment, called out in his drill instructor's voice, "Veterans Vanguard, Aten Hut." As one, the bikers snapped to attention, their salutes joining Jack's and the governor's. Townspeople, caught up in the emotion of the moment, placed their hands over their hearts. Even Tommy and his friends, who had spent the night helping out, stood straight and respectful. In that moment, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, bathing the scene in warm light, something profound happened in Millbrook. The divisions that had existed between old and young, rich and poor, law-abiding citizens, and troubled youth seemed to melt away. They were all united in their respect for Jack's sacrifice and what it represented. It was then that Jack, his body finally reaching its absolute limit, began to sway. His knees buckled and he started to crumple. But before he could fall, strong hands caught him. Bear was on one side, the governor on the other, holding Jack upright, supporting his weight while maintaining their salutes. "It's okay, Jack," Bear said softly. "You've done it. You can stand down now." Tears flowed freely down Jack's face as he finally, after 19 hours and 23 minutes, lowered his arm. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, many wiping away tears of their own. As Bear and the governor helped Jack to a waiting ambulance, Sarah Mitchell rushing to attend to him, the atmosphere in Millbrook was electric. People were hugging, shaking hands, exchanging phone numbers. The barriers that had existed between different groups were crumbling in the wake of this shared experience. Tommy Ferris, the young man who had arrived with his troublemaking friends the night before, approached Bear as Jack was being tended to. "Sir," he said, his voice uncharacteristically respectful, is there anything else we can do to help?" Bear looked at the young man, seeing the spark of purpose that had been ignited. "As a matter of fact, son, there is. How would you and your friends like to help us set up a proper veterans support center here in Millbrook?" Tommy's eyes widened, a smile spreading across his face. "Yes, sir. We'd be honored." As the ambulance prepared to take Jack to the hospital for much-needed medical attention, the governor addressed the crowd once more. "What we've witnessed here is nothing short of extraordinary," he said. "Sergeant Hawkins' dedication has reminded us all of the true meaning of service and sacrifice. But it's not just Jack. It's all of you. The way this community has come together, the way you've supported one another through the night, that's what makes America great." He paused, looking around at the diverse faces in the crowd. "I came here to honor a hero, but I found an entire community of heroes. And I promise you this, Millbrook will not be forgotten. We're going to make sure that the spirit of unity and service that was born here continues to grow." As the governor finished speaking, a new sound filled the air. From somewhere in the crowd, a voice began to sing. "Oh, say can you see, by the dawn's early light." Others joined in, the national anthem swelling as more and more voices added to the chorus. It was a spontaneous outpouring of patriotism and community spirit, fitting end to a night that had changed them all. As Jack was loaded into the ambulance, his eyes heavy with exhaustion but shining with pride, he knew that his stand had been worth every agonizing second. He had set out to honor his son and his fallen comrades, but in doing so, he had ignited a spark of unity and purpose that would burn bright in Millbrook years to come. The sun climbed higher, promising a new day filled with possibility. And as the last notes of the anthem faded away, people of Millbrook knew that this was not an end, but a beginning. The real work, healing divides, supporting veterans, and building a stronger community, was just starting. But after the events of the past 24 hours, they were ready for the challenge. Together, they would stand tall, just as Jack Hawkins had done, facing whatever the future might bring, with courage, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to one another. In the weeks and months that followed Jack Hawkins' extraordinary vigil, the town of Millbrook underwent a transformation that few could have predicted. The spirit of unity and purpose that had been kindled during those 19 hours didn't fade away with the dawn. Instead, it grew, spreading through the community like wildfire. Jack himself spent several days in the hospital, his body recovering from the immense strain it had endured. But even as he lay in his hospital bed, surrounded by get-well cards and flowers from people he'd never met, the seeds of change he'd planted, already beginning to sprout. The Veterans Vanguard Motorcycle Club, led by the indomitable Bear, made good on their promise to establish a veterans support center in Millbrook. They found an ally in Mayor Thompson, who, inspired by the events at the memorial, dedicated city resources to the project. The old community center on Elm Street, long neglected, was repurposed and renovated. Tommy Ferris and his friends, true to their word, threw themselves into the effort. What started as manual labor, painting walls, moving furniture, soon evolved into something more. Bear, recognizing the potential in these young men and women, took them under his wing. He taught them about organization, leadership, and the value of service to others. Within 6 months, the Millbrook Veterans Support Center was up and running, offering everything from job placement services to PTSD counseling. Tommy, much to everyone's surprise, including his own, found himself in charge of a youth mentorship program, pairing at-risk teens with veteran mentors. The ripple effect spread beyond the center. Local businesses, inspired by the community spirit they'd witnessed, started a Hire a Vet initiative. The high school instituted a new civics curriculum, emphasizing the importance of community engagement and national service. But perhaps the most profound change was in the town's atmosphere. The divisions that had once seemed so insurmountable, between old and young, rich and poor, longtime residents and newcomers, began to blur. People who had stood side by side through that long night found they had more in common than they'd realized. As for Jack, his recovery was slow but steady. Sarah Mitchell, his devoted physical therapist, worked tirelessly to help him regain his strength. But it was more than just physical therapy. Sarah found herself drawn to Jack's quiet strength and unwavering sense of duty. Their relationship deepened, evolving from therapist and patient to friends, and eventually to something more. 6 months to the day after his vigil, Jack stood once again before the Veterans Memorial. This time, he wasn't alone. Beside him stood Sarah, her hand entwined with his. Bear and his bikers formed an honor guard. Tommy and his friends, now respectable members of the community, stood proudly in their Veterans Support Center t-shirts. And there, in front of the community he'd helped transform, Jack Hawkins spoke publicly for the first time about his experience. "When I started this journey," he began, his voice strong and clear, "I thought I was standing for those who could no longer stand for themselves. For my son, Michael, and for every brave soul who made the ultimate sacrifice. But what I've come to realize is that I was never standing alone." He paused, looking out at the faces of those gathered, faces that now seemed as familiar and dear to him as family. "Each of you stood with me that night, in your own way. And in doing so, we all stood for something greater than ourselves. We stood for the idea that a community, united in purpose and compassion, can overcome any obstacle. That the sacrifices of the few can inspire the many to become their best selves." As Jack spoke, many in the crowd wiped away tears. They had all been changed by the events of that night, in ways both large and small. Governor Harmon, who had kept his promise to support Millbrook, stepped forward. "Sergeant Hawkins," he said, "your act of devotion has inspired not just this town, but our entire state. That's why I'm proud to announce that the Alabama legislature has unanimously voted to establish an annual Day of Remembrance and Unity in honor of your vigil and the community spirit it inspired." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Jack, overwhelmed by emotion, could only nod his thanks. As the ceremony concluded, Jack found himself surrounded by well-wishers, but there was one face he sought out in particular. Tommy Ferris approached, looking almost unrecognizable from the troubled youth he'd been just months ago. "Mr. Hawkins," Tommy said, voice filled with respect, "I just wanted to thank you. What you did. It didn't just honor the veterans. It gave people like me a chance to be part of something bigger than ourselves. You showed us what real strength looks like." Jack placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Son, the strength was always in you. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us it's there." As the sun began to set on Millbrook, casting a warm glow over the gathered community, Jack Hawkins looked out over the town he called home for so many years. He saw more than buildings and streets. He saw the bonds that had been forged, the lives that had been changed. He thought of Michael, and for the first time in years, the memory brought more comfort than pain. He knew that his son would be proud, not just of his father's act of endurance, but of the way an entire community had come together in the spirit of service and remembrance. Sarah squeezed his hand, and Jack turned to her with a smile. "Ready to go home?" she asked. Jack nodded, but took one last look at the memorial, at the flag that now flew day and night, illuminated in honor of those who had sacrificed everything. "You know," he said softly, "I think I finally understand what Michael meant when he said he was fighting for more than just the country. He was fighting for this, for the potential in every community to come together, to support one another, to be better than we ever thought we could be." As Jack and Sarah walked away, hand in hand, the last rays of sunlight caught the bronze plaque that had been added to the memorial. It read, "In honor of all who have served and those who continue to serve, not just in uniform, in their community, may we always stand together in remembrance and in hope." The story of Jack Hawkins and the night that changed Millbrook would be told for generations. But more than that, it would be lived in the daily acts of kindness, service, and unity that had become the hallmark of a town that had learned the true meaning of standing tall.